When one mentions the name Pablo Fanque, there is usually someone in the audience that will recall purchasing the Sgt. Pepper album. The last track on the first side is entitled For the Benefit of Mr. Kite, the lyrics of which were inspired by the subject of my talk today, the circus, and in particular that of the 19th century showman Pablo Fanque. Indeed, the name Pablo Fanque has become a cultural icon spanning 3 centuries and the topic of a book that was released in 2017. On the 31st of January 1967, while making a promotional film for Strawberry Fields Forever, John Lennon wandered into an antique shop close to their hotel in Sevenoaks, Kent. There he bought a framed Victorian circus poster from 1843. The poster announced Pablo Fanque's Circus Royal coming to Town Meadows in Rochdale. It grandly announced that the circus would be for the benefit of Mr. Kite and would feature Mr. J. Henderson, the celebrated Somerset thrower, and Xanthus the horse. Mr. Kite was William Kite, a performer and the son of circus owner James Kite. In 1810, James had founded Kite's Pavilion Circus. William was engaged by Pablo Fanque's circus on a number of occasions between 1843 and 1845. Fanque, whose real name was William Darby, was Britain's first black circus owner, born in Norwich in 1810. Lennon knew nothing of the origins of the words on the poster and what they represented, simply hanging the poster in his music room at his home in Weybridge, and began to use it as an inspiration for a song. Some of the facts he changed. The circus was coming to Bishopsgate rather than Rochdale. The horse became Henry. The circus became a fair. Mr. Henderson, rather than Mr. Kite, promised to change the world. But who was Pablo Fanque, and what does his career tell us about the Victorian circus? When he died in May 1871, the reporter from the Leeds Times covered the news stating, "His history was really a romance of real life. A splendid rider, fearless and enterprising in spirit. Nothing daunted him, not even the dark clouds of adversity. And to listen to his stories of equestrian experience and thus be brought vividly, almost face to face, with the great people who patronized him and his establishment, was like reading the story of a paladin or a crusader of old. The writer of this notice has often requested Pablo to furnish him with the most salient and racy incidents of his career, but the day was put off until the angel of death stepped in and finally closed the arrangement." William Darby was born in Norwich, the son of John Darby and Mary Stamp. Until quite recently, his date of birth was believed to be 1796, but recent research has shown it was 1810. Some believe he was the son of a black servant and lived in Burr Street, but it is now generally recognised that he was a pauper child, with parents in and out of the workhouse, being born in St Andrew's Workhouse, which was part of the Blackfriars complex of buildings that still stands today. What was it like for this mixed-race boy in Norwich at the beginning of the 19th century? Norwich had radical traditions, home to wealthy dissenters and radicals who supported the ideas of Thomas Paine and initially those of the French Revolution. A drawn-out war, bloodshed during the Terror, and the rise of Napoleon had muted those views. Many were vehemently against slavery and supported abolition. However, economic depression during this period meant the working class were protective of their jobs. Norwich had one of the widest electorates, with handloom weavers having the right to vote. They distrusted outsiders, as found by Ukansor Gronishaw, a freed Slade who found, quote, "We met with great deal of ill treatment, and found it very difficult to live, we were scarcely get work to do, and were obliged to pawn our clothes. We were ready to sink under our troubles. Euchancor was helped by one of the Quaker Gurney family, who, on hearing about his distress, paid his rent and bought the family a loom and a chaff-chopping machine to establish himself and his family in the city. The Darby family had no such benefactor. Hardship meant that parents made tough choices, and at some time William's father apprenticed him to William Batty, a circus proprietor. Apprenticeships in the circus were personal arrangements. Children were effectively sold for a few shillings. In return they would be trained, firstly in tumbling and acrobatics, a few then going on to become equestrians, perhaps becoming an expert on one act of horsemanship. We can get an insight into the life of a circus apprentice from interviews that Henry Mayhew undertook with street performers in the late 1840s. One day, instead of going to school, I went along with this man into the streets, and then he did the Risley business, throwing me about on his hands and feet. I was about 13 years old then. Then I got chucking about à la Risley my little brother, who was about 7 years old. I was along with my little brother, and both dressed up in tights and spangled trunks. Say he, "Oh, you will take to tumbling, will you? Well then, come along with me, and we'll go into the country." Then he took us down to Norwich and to Yarmouth. Then he beat me, and would give me no clothes or money, for he spent it to go and get drunk. The Risley business was named after Richard Risley Clark, an American artist who developed the technique of spinning his daughters from feet to hands while lying on his back. We don't know how Darby became apprenticed to Batty, but do know there was a thriving circus building in Norwich known as the Pantheon or Rotunda. It hosted circuses as part of its entertainment season and stood in a pleasure garden on the west side of the city, being situated on the land that today is where the present Marsh Insurance Building is, in Queen's Road, between the St. Stephen's Roundabout and Sainsbury's. Later this area became the Victoria and City Railway Station, operated by the Midland and Great Northern, the building itself being incorporated into the ticket office. Today we associate the circus arena as a ring within a big top tent, but this was not the case when William would have started his career. In 1768, a former sergeant major in the 15th Light Hussars, called Philip Astley, set up a riding school in a wayside field near Lambeth Marsh. He performed feats such as straddling to, cantering or jumping horses, and doing handstands on the saddle with a pint pot. He did not use the word circus, but called the arena a circle or amphitheatre, with a diameter ring of 42 feet, being the perfect running circumference of a horse, in which the rider could perform tricks using centrifugal forces. Astley defined the form of the modern circus, and his amphitheatre, shown here in 1808, established the type of building it was performed in. Indeed, until the 1850s, circuses were held in purpose-built wooden buildings, or in theatres adapted with a ring in the centre of the auditorium. The entertainment was equestrian in nature, with tumbling, clowning, rope walking as peripheral to the main purpose. William Darby took the exotic name Pablo Fanque, and by 1832 he was astonishing audiences on the cord fluxo in Batty's circus. A description of his performance in Brighton was given by the local journal as astonishing, though looked on by the spectators, particularly the ladies, not without trembling. The following week Batty described in his advertising what the audience could expect. "The entertainments will commence with Feats of Leaping by Pablo Fanque, the man of colour, the loftiest jumper in England, who will take a number of surprising leaps without the assistance of any elastic apparatus. First, over a garter, 12 foot high. Second, through a hoop, 2 foot 6 inches in diameter. Third, through cross hoops. Fourth, through a balloon, 2 foot 9 inches in diameter. Fifth, through 2 balloons. Sixth, through a military drum, 4.5 feet 6 inches long. 7, will take a surprising leap over 10 horses. 8th, will leap through a hoop of real steel daggers. And lastly, an unparalleled leap over a post-chaise lengthways. By the time Pablo returned to Norwich with Batty in the spring of 1840, he was still starting the performance with his extraordinary leaps and other gymnastic feats. But the real stars of the ring were the equestrians. The programme that spring included a well-appointed troop of equestrians, as Spanish cavaliers and ladies, making a splendid entree on Mr. Batty's numerous stud, under the able direction of Mr. Smith, the riding master of the establishment. Mr. Batty himself at length appeared in a costume of a Russian courier. He distinguished himself equally by adroitness and intrepidity, whilst performing the promised feat of riding and managing a number of his well-trained horses. It is one of the finest exhibitions of the kind that we recollect ever to have seen. Pablo's ambition was to be like his hero Batty, and to rise to be the best in the profession. By late 1841, Fanque had made the decision to leave Batty and set up his own circus. It's clear that Batty supported this move, and together with Richard Bullard, the Norwich brewer, financed his new business. The first newspaper report of his new venture was in Warrington in January 1842. In March he was in Bridge Street, Chester, a run which was to last until the end of May. The 1840s was the growth period for the provincial circus. Better established proprietors such as the Cook family were building or had previously built wooden, or in some cases brick amphitheatres in major towns such as Hull, Glasgow, Perth, Liverpool and Manchester. For example, the Royal Amphitheatre in Charlotte Street, Liverpool, could hold 4,000 people. Circus was becoming so popular that conventional theatres were being converted to accommodate a ring, and new theatres, such as the new Standard in Shoreditch, shown here, were built with mechanical workings that enabled the boxes to be withdrawn on rails to accommodate equestrian performances. Derby would have at first hired such buildings, which were readily available, and often situated in the traditional areas for fairs and meetings. Many towns had these open spaces, such as Chadwick's Orchard in Preston, Peterloo Fields in Manchester, and King Charles Croft in Leeds. It was at King Charles's Croft in Leeds that a fatal accident was to occur in 1848 during the performance. On Saturday night last, a most awful scene occurred at Pablo Fanque's equestrian establishment, caused by the giving way of a beam supporting the pit and gallery, by which about 600 persons were hurled to the ground. The place throughout was crammed to excess, but more especially this part of the house. The source of attraction on that evening was Mr. Wallet the clown, who is a decided favourite in this quarter, and everything up to 9:45 had proceeded favourably, when a slight cracking was heard in the pit and gallery, which caused such alarm to the people at that part of the building that they rose simultaneously. They had no sooner done this than the whole fabric gave way, which was caused in great measure by the sudden change of position, and the greater portion of them fell below, those at the top of the pit having a considerable distance to travel. Everything was now changed from mirth to confusion, and to render this state of things doubly bad, the greater part of the lights went out. Shrieks and screams were heard from the disabled. The people in the other parts of the house were clinging to posts, expecting their turn next. Others swooning under fear and excitement, and those who were more collected searching anxiously for a place of egress, for the door, which had given them admittance, was completely barricaded by the fallen timber. The gases, however, were soon lit again, and every assistance was rendered by those connected with the establishment to relieve the people amongst the ruins who were injuring each other. Fanque's wife, together with Mrs. Wallet, was at the cash desk directly under the part of the structure that fell. Wallet records in his own autobiography, "My wife and Mrs. Pablo were seated together in the pay office beneath the falling mass. Mrs. Wallet happened to be sitting upright and was knocked down by the timbers. She received some injury, but was not dangerously hurt. But poor Mrs. Pablo, who was looking over the front of the money-taking place, was struck by a falling beam and killed on the spot. In the confusion that followed, some vile thief stole her watch from her side, and her box containing upwards of £50, the takings of the evening. At the inquest that followed, it was showed that Pablo had rented the building from a man named Barton, it having been built for another circus proprietor. In the intervening time it had been hired for storage, and props holding up that area had been removed. The coroner instructed the jury to return a verdict of accidental death." Accidents were relatively commonplace in the Victorian circus, particularly for the performers themselves. We should regard working in this relatively new entertainment industry as hard-working labour, no less hazardous than in a factory. This became more so in the 1850s, when the circus began to move from purpose-built amphitheatres to big-top tents. As one performer put it, "It's very hard work, and I have worked 17 hours a day. Sometimes I've been so tired at night that I've actually lain down in my dress and never washed, but slept like that all night." The rewards for the best artists were better than working in industry, though. We know that Fanque paid £7 a week to Arthur Nelson, the clown, in 1857 for his appearance at Bristol, and the same performer could command as much as £15 while tenting. These performers also negotiated the rights to benefits towards the end of their run with a particular circus. On their benefit night, they would receive the takings from the evening minus expenses, and often, to reduce costs, do much higher performance of the programme themselves. However, bringing in the crowds towards the end of a long run in the town often needed additional effort, and they would offer a free performance in a public space within the town to whet the appetites of those that might consider going. One example of this was Madame Caroline's performance while Pablo's circus was at Bolton in May 1869. Madame Caroline, who assumes the title The Female Blondine, has been announced to give an outdoor performance. She was to walk along a rope stretched from the third story of the old Coronation Mills to the top of the circus, the height of the rope from the ground being about 40 feet, and the distance be gone over some 80 feet. About 7:30 the lady set out from the window. She tripped along the rope for a few feet with light and easy step. About 15 feet from the starting point, however, she came to a thick knot, several inches long. She tried to cross it but failed, and then turned back. A moment afterwards she resumed her journey. She approached the knot cautiously and partially crossed it, but just as her hindmost foot was leaving it, she stumbled. At once she threw aside her pole, and in a desperate effort she grasped the rope. She is a strong, muscular woman, and exerted herself greatly to regain her position on the rope. But despite her endeavours she remained suspended by the hands. The greatest excitement prevailed amongst the hundreds of spectators. There were loud cries of "Lower the rope!" and the rope was lowered a number of feet. A number of men then amassed themselves together directly below the woman, and begged her to fall. She did as advised, and was caught by the men, and although the distance she fell was a mere 20 feet, she sustained no injury beyond the fright and a shake. She appeared afterwards in the circus on the tightrope, and much to the delight of the audience, went through a series of extraordinary feats. It's clear from accounts that some of these accidents were staged in order to attract a greater crowd that evening in the circus. These female wire walkers often called themselves the female blondie, after Jean-Francois Gravelet, who took his father's nickname Blondie. On the 30th of June 1859, he instantly became famous by crossing the Niagara Falls Gorge. In the next few weeks, he walked at night, on stilts, and with a sack over his head, did back somersaults on the rope, struggled in chains, and cooked a meal over the gorge on a large stove. In August 1859, he asked somebody to volunteer so that he could carry them on his back. No one stepped forward, so his manager, Harry Colcord, was pressed into service. The sight of the terrified Harry dismounting 6 times during the crossing, because Blondie was in trouble, was the greatest thrill yet. A guy wire broke, and Colcord claimed gamblers had sabotaged it. The following year, Blondie returned to the falls to perform for the Prince of Wales. He offered to carry the bulky prince on his back, but the invitation was graciously declined. Instead, he took his own assistant, Romain Moulin. Halfway across, Moulin got off for a rest and refused to climb back on. Blondie threatened to leave him to get home on his own. The prince watched thunderstruck as the two men raged at each other in French. In 1861, the prince brought Blondie to London to perform 180 feet up in the Crystal Palace, and Blondie subsequently appeared many times in England and on the continent. He retired for a short time, but he resumed his career in 1880, and he gave his last performance in Belfast at the age of 72. By this time, the performance of women and children had come under scrutiny in the circus and similar entertainment venues, such as fairs and festivals. A concerted campaign was gathering pace concerning the morals of those that watched women, in particular, perform such acts. The clothes they wore and the immodesty of their performance high up on the wire or trapeze offended sensibilities, but most of all corrupted Victorian ideals of society. In these haunts, the comic song and the ballet serve up to lead to the greatest sensation of the evening, when a woman, clothed in a dress far more unwomanly than rags, is swung upon ropes and jerked between strings of the trapeze over the heads of an audience who are pleasantly excited over the chance of the poor creature breaking her neck before the performance concluded. Now and again the papers would recall the fall of a Lady Leotard, and her retirement into cripplehood from her profession. These narratives gave zest to the spectacles. We do not so much care to dwell upon the impropriety of this female acrobatism as upon its cruelty, it becoming competitive in boldness and risk. These sorry sights are training the people who look on them into a taste for the most vicious of all pleasures, the pleasure of wanton incitement, provoked by the prospect of seeing a woman do violence to every instinct of her nature, risk her life and limb upon a skill that has been acquired at a terrible cost and sacrifice. More dangerous exhibitions not only increased the expectations of crowds watching women's performances, but also brought into question Victorian notions of family and the view of women in society. This is best highlighted by the death of Selina Powell at Aston Park, Birmingham, in July 1863, at a charity event organised by the Order of Foresters. This Punch cartoon illustrates the sort of furore there was after the event. At about 6:30, Madame Genevieve ascended the ladder, and taking the balance pole in her hand, stepped out on the rope with much confidence. She walked halfway across the rope, and then returning, she had 2 very heavy chains tied to her hands and feet. Her action was not impeded, for the right foot tied to the right hand, and the left foot to the left hand, the chains being sufficiently long to allow her to make free use of hands and feet. The chains encumbered her only by their weight. Again she walked along the rope without the slightest apparent trepidation. She walked the whole length of the rope, stepping over the point of the upright pole by which the rope was supported in the centre. At the other end of the rope she received from a man, who was in attendance, a bag or sack she placed over her head and shoulders. Again she went upon the rope, stepping with confidence, but had only gone about a yard when there was a crash, and before the cry of horror had died from the lips of the spectators, Madame Genevieve had fallen at the feet of her husband and was dead. The crowd rushed towards the spot, but the police were able to keep a small space around the dead woman. Powell's death was even more shocking to the public when it was discovered that not only was she the breadwinner for her husband and 6 children, but was also between 6 and 8 months pregnant. The circus was both creating and reflecting a popular culture which gave a dilemma for the civic authorities in the swiftly growing industrial towns. Rowdiness and drunken behaviour was a serious concern on Saturday nights, fuelled by the availability of cheap beer. Some condemned the fact that low-cost recreation and amusement in concert halls and the circus only exacerbated the problem, while others pointed out that beer house owners complained when Fanque's circus was in town that their establishments were empty. Circus proprietors such as Pablo sought to reassure their potential audience of the propriety of their performance and its effect on those watching. In one newspaper advertisement, Pablo stated, "It is the present intention to produce a series of Olympic exploits, at once astonishing and recreative. And so cautious will be the selection that the tender father, the affectionate husband, or admiring lover need not fear the blush of modesty will ever be excited by an exhibition within my arena." An example of moral outrage towards the circus can be seen in the case of Grace Darling. In September 1839, the story of the rescue of passengers of the Forfarshire paddle steamer by Grace Darling and her father gripped the Victorian public imagination. Here was a heroine that summed up the values of the age. William Batty was quick to seize on the story and the admiration it had engendered, by proceeding to give a benefit night in her honour at his Circus Royal on the 8th of November 1838 in Edinburgh. The proceeds amounted to £20, and Batty dispatched his acting manager, Mr. Sylvester, to deliver the money. Grace wrote a letter of thanks to Mr. Batty, which was promptly published in the Caledonian Mercury on the 15th of November, no doubt to provide publicity of his generosity. In it she states that at some point she would like to thank him personally by visiting his arena in Edinburgh. The Edinburgh Courant reprinted it, but added their own comments concerning her naivety, which tells us a great deal about underlying moral attitudes towards the circus. "It is clear she has no conception of the nature of what she proposes to do. Fortunately, however, she has fallen into trustworthy hands, and we have too much confidence in the good sense and good feeling of Mr. Batty to be imagining for a moment that he would encourage a woman who had deserved so well of her country to place herself in a position which can be regarded in no other light than a show, competing for the applause of the vulgar with its well-trained quadrupeds. It was not long after the press were to suggest that Batty had gone much further by offering her a contract with the circus, a notion he was forced to deny. The publication of the book Grace Darling, The Maids of the Isles, from which this illustration comes, turned Batty's generosity into a cynical attempt to corrupt the morals of an innocent and naive family, and as such the incident was cited as a moral lesson for all. While moral indignation was concerned with women performers, parliamentary debates in the 1860s and 70s centred on the wider issue of child performers. Legislation regarding child labour had been enacted to curb the worst abuses in factories and mines in the 1830s and 1840s. But those involved in the entertainment industries remained untouched. Given the very visible nature of children, whether performing in the ring or at fairs and festivals, it was only a matter of time that concern led to action. Moral opinion over the treatment of child performers was articulated by The Waif Story, a strand of writing that appeared in the mid-1860s and lasted until the early 1890s. Circus apprentices and children provided the perfect subject for many of these books, given that the author could easily draw on the seductive power of a circus life as liberator from the perceived harshness of a respectable home. Typical of this genre is a book, A Peep Behind the Scenes, written by Mrs. O. F. Walton and published by the Religious Tract Society in 1877. The main character is Rosalie, the 12-year-old daughter of a theatrical booth owner, who meets stereotypical characters from the fairground and circus communities. The moral purpose, as suggested by the title, is to warn its young readers not to be seduced by the seeming glamour and allure of the circus. There were many young girls there, some of them servants in respectable families, where they enjoyed every comfort. Yet they looked up at little Rosalie with eyes of admiration and envy. They thought her life was much happier than theirs, and that her lot was greatly to be desired. They looked at the white dress and the pink roses, and contrasted them with their own warm but homely garments. They watched the pretty girl going through her part gracefully and easily, and they contrasted her work with theirs. How interesting! How delightful, they thought, to be doing this instead of scrubbing floors or washing clothes or nursing children. But they knew nothing of the life behind the scenes, of the sick mother, the wretched home, the poor and insufficient food, the dirty, ragged frock. They knew nothing of the bitter tears which had been wiped away, nor of the weary aching of the little feet which were dancing so lightly over the stage. Walton's book became a bestseller and quickly sold more than 2.5 million copies. Sales were fueled by it being a favourite as a prize in Sunday schools. In 1879, Parliament passed the Children's Dangerous Performances Act, being specifically aimed at circuses, music halls and other places of public entertainment. It fined any parent or guardian who caused children under the age of 14 to take part in any exhibition or performance dangerous to life or limb. Walton's books were aimed at children, but there was also those that were more hard-hitting and aimed at adults. Despite the 1878 legislation, campaigners such as Amy Reed published novels which were much more graphic in their content than those of Mrs. Walton. Ruby contains descriptions of child beating and cruelty that readers would find just as distasteful today. In the preface of her follow-up novel, Slaves of the Sawdust, she explains the motive and zeal for her cause. Much as I anticipated opposition to the indictment in my novel Ruby, in which I deal with the cruelties employed in the training of young people for the amusement of thoughtless crowds, little did I expect that the selfish unbelief of some professing philanthropy would have been my greatest difficulty in arousing public sympathy for a long-suffering class, which are as yet practically helpless. It is true I drew a pitiful picture. I set down hard truths, truths which those who cry out about sweaters in the slums dare not have uncovered. I made known in Ruby a great deal, but there is more to divulge about the slaves of the sawdust. My mission shall be to tell it. I will go on until I have gained the protection I crave for those who perform wonderful feats for the pleasure of the people. I shall never weary waiting for victory. I shall never tire of my self-imposed task. I intend to dedicate all my faculties, all my time, to win the cause of the young. No opposers shall obstruct my path, even if they dare to impute to me the stigma which must forever rest on those who put idealism under the truth of garb. Not all literature was necessarily unfavourable towards the circus. Charles Dickens provided a portrait of the circus in his 1854 novel Hard Times. It becomes his metaphor for the importance of fancy or imagination in life, in contrast to blind and uncaring utilitarianism that reduces individuals to numbers and societies to facts. Dickens contrasts the hardness of industrialization against a more carefree and naturalistic past. He sets the background for understanding the nostalgia that began to manifest itself in the late 1860s, following the introduction of American circuses in Britain, with their big-top tents and exotic animals. Fanque, in his advertisement, points this out. Grant it in the present day bubble and froth, empty air with gilded outside show and meagre inside, seem to take the ignorant by storm. Give but one look to Pablo's circus, you are then bound to visit again and again. It will remind you of the days when you were children, when you went with your pa's and ma's to see Pablo and his noble and educated steed Beda, whose instinct and docility have been the theme and admiration of thronging and delighted audiences. By 1865, Fanque was losing the battle against these larger and better financed establishments. He continued his circus, mainly tenting, in the smaller industrial towns of Lancashire around Manchester, remaining a stalwart at fairs and other traditional holiday gatherings throughout the region. Even during the Lancashire cotton famine of 1861-65, he maintained his presence in the region. Examining his itinerary during these years shows that at times his retinue was very small, hiring his skills and name to others, while concentrating on bringing on apprentices and actively seeking children to train in equestrianism. William Derby was to pass away at the Britannia Inn, Stockport, on the 5th of May 1871. In death, the true state of his affairs became known. John Walker, a juggler in his circus, had lent him £5, which he required to be repaid, but Pablo had died suddenly. As a result, he sued Elizabeth Derby, his widow. In court, Elizabeth's barrister asserted that the defendant had not a rag, her husband having died hopelessly insolvent. Some time before his death, the deceased assigned every particle of his property in consideration of a sum of £150 lent to him by a Mr. Knight of Manchester, who had now taken possession of everything. In order to settle the case, her barrister paid the £5, out of his own pocket. In any study of the history of popular culture, William Darby holds a special place. Within his life, both he and his circus reflected attributes of popularism, the wistful desire of a generation to recall the past, and an institution embedded in the fabric of society. In the late 20th century, his name's association with John Lennon in the lyrics of Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite enabled another generation to identify with its call to challenge the world. In the first quarter of the 21st century, Fanque has become a symbol of multiculturalism, the subject of performance artists in Britain and America, a black entrepreneurial role model, and an example of how our views of the past cannot but be influenced by our view of the present. There's a lot more to know about Pablo Fanque and the Victorian Circus, which can be found in the pages of my book, available on the Poppyland website and in bookshops. However, in conclusion, I shall leave the final word to Pablo himself, played by Joe Williams when he came to Norwich as part of the 250th celebration of Circus in 2018.
Roll up, roll up, roll up, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Pablo Fanque's Circus Royale will open the most neat and commodious, the best arranged and handsomest circus ever erected in this city for gymnastic and equestrian performances. He's such a fascinating character in terms of what he achieved compared to where he came from, the workhouse, and as a gentleman of colour as well. It's not what we expect, but Africa has more than a 400-500 year history with Europe, and there were many figures in different trades and industries, and not just slavery, which is the usual narrative. See Miss Smith's daring and electrifying acte d'equitation, leaping over canvases and through hoops on her rapid steed. I, Mr. Pablo Fanque, will introduce my own celebrated mare, Bida.